Lucas, for the opportunity. My title and my topic for this is something I'm working on as part of my doctoral project. And the topic is public interest criteria and the extent to which it affects merger consistency in South Africa. So it's still a working title, but the main focus for this paper is public interest and how it's included in the law. And I want to empirically test how the decisions for the tribunal have been over the years. Needless to say as well, I'm working on this project with my supervisor is Professor Willem Boshoff. So I've been working with him on this, and I would like to thank him as well for some of the contributions that are in the paper. Okay, so this is the outline for the paper. I'll start with the introduction. I'll start by defining what public interest is, and then I'll just outline a bit on what the public interest versus competition goals. There's a debate about it, and what people have, different people's views through the years. And then the literature review will look at how public interest has been framed over the years, as in how it's included in the legislation for different countries or different regions of the world, and the different forms of public interest, apart from the way it's framed in the legislature, but then the way it's enforced and the different arguments that come up in terms of public interest and the different cases that we've seen so far. And then I'll give a general overview for public interest in South Africa. And then on the empirical methodology, there are two methods that I'm going to be using to answer two different questions as part of the objectives, as you're going to see. And that's going to be the ordinary least squares and the Probit model. And then I'll conclude by giving the results. Okay, so when we're talking about public interest, often in competition, so the main aim for competition law, as it was established, is to introduce efficiency by regulating firms and creating a competitive environment, I should say. So, but what we have seen over the years, in recent years, has been this inclusion of non-competition goals, okay? So these are often cited as public interest. So these non-competition goals are often cited as public interest criteria. So not to confuse it with public interest, which comes about as a matter of enforcing competition law. So when enforcing competition law by itself, you actually do get some public interest benefits. So these are fair benefits which can be termed public interest, like lowering of prices, consumer choices. That's also a matter of public interest at the end of the day. So these, but what I'm specifically defining is those criteria that are either included in law or that are exemptions from the actual traditional goals for competition. So when a country is pursuing higher employment using competition law, okay, so that's an exemption. So that's a public interest criteria. So some explicitly define it in their law, in their act, while others don't. So that's part of something that I'll be looking at as well, as you'll see. So when it comes to the debates of public interest, some have been opposing to this view of public interest. I remember, in terms of as I read through the literature, there is Eleanor Fox as well, who wrote a paper in 2000, soon after the enactment of the Act for competition in South Africa. She said it would be difficult to include this different type of criteria. Ricky was also of the opposing view to this inclusion of public interest criteria in competition law. So there have been oppositions as well. Boshoff and others also wrote a paper in 2012 which talk about, so they were just talking about the cost that would come with the inclusion of public interest criteria, and how some of the effects might be offset by some of the competition effects might be offset by the inclusion of these public interest criteria. So he mainly talked about the welfare effects and how defining welfare is a matter of importance in this case, because when you're looking at a consumer standard, we might say, okay, fine, improving welfare through including maybe employment would be very nice, but then that might be offset by the lower prices that might be lost from doing such things and including. So he also highlights to that point. Lewis has been a major as it pertains to developing countries, and this is mainly because most of them are transitioning from one state to another, one state where there were a lot of state-owned firms and monopolies to a more competitive environment, and there are a lot of societal issues that come with that. So these also need to be dealt with in competition law. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's the best route to take, but everyone has their opinion, and it's still ongoing. But despite all that, a lot of countries have still included competition law, and I mean public interest objectives in the competition law and in the enforcement and the policies. Okay, so what this paper seeks to find out, sorry, let me just go back to the slide. One of the important things is this one, which is one of the things the business community has been raising, that the introduction of public interest considerations in the major review analysis is potentially counterproductive. The reason is that business contemplating transactions require substantive and procedural certainty as well as transparency in the major review process. So they're just saying that the inclusion, since when we just have a competition standard for mergers, we are very certain of what's involved, and since we have been practicing that for a long time, we have clearly defined goals. But when you bring in some of this public interest criteria, the lines get blurred, and we're not very sure of what to expect. And when making business decisions, we need to be sure of what to expect. When we're going for a merger, we need to calculate the costs and the benefits and in making of the decision. So with that said, the objectives of this study are that I want to determine the duration of public interest consideration cases in practice. That's in South Africa. So my study is based in South Africa. So some of the results, we find that public interest consideration cases take 18% more time to evaluate on average. That's something that I found. And to determine the differences in duration for the different public interest criteria. So as you see as I go along, in the Act, in the Competition Act for South Africa, some of these different criteria have been included, and they're evaluated on that basis. So on the basis of broad black-based economic empowerment, employment, impact on a particular industry, and the ability of small business to perform. So all these things are the different public interest criteria that have been listed in the Act. So I also want to determine if there's the differences in the cases that have these different things evaluated, if the duration is different. And we find that among the criteria, the broad black-based economic empowerment take more time to evaluate, to go through the entire pipeline for the investigation. The second objective is on the consistency. So what I mean is I would like to determine if there are differences in tribunal decisions. Since we have a court system in South Africa, so the decisions end up, I mean, the merger cases end up in court. These are large mergers, they end up in court, and they have to be decided whether to be approved with conditions or prohibited. So for my data set, I only have those that have been approved and approved with conditions. So those are the two standards on which I'm evaluating the different measures. So I find that there are differences in the tribunal decisions for public interest factors, which could be viewed as a difference in the weighting of the factors, okay? and then to determine the differences in magnitudes as well. And then I find out that the ability of small firms give a higher probability of approval with conditions relative to cases without this ability of small firms, if there were no arguments that came with the ability of small firms to compete. Okay. Okay, so when looking at public interest in the literature, so a lot of questions go as how does it appear in the different jurisdictions? How widespread is it? I mean, how many countries are actually dealing with this in the competition law? And then how many cases appear over time? And is it different for developing countries and developed countries? How does it appear in the different states? Okay, so the literature review, that's it. That's a framing of public interest, which is how it appears in practice and in the legislation, as well as in the different countries. And then the forms of public interest. So these are the cases in terms of how it appears in different countries. Like I'll give examples of cases, how it appeared in developing countries and developed countries, and how they argued for the different things. And then lastly, I'll just check out public interest in South Africa, how it appears in the law, and some different cases that have been dealt with so far. Okay, so in terms of the framing of public interest, there are mainly three ways of framing it, four ways to be exact. The fourth way is that it is not included at all in your competition policy or competition law. So the first one is you can put it as part of the substantive test, which is the test that you use, the legal test for assessing whether a merger should go through. So in South Africa, in Malawi and Namibia, these are all developing countries. They have stated it as part of the substantive test. So needless to say that in developing countries, that's what mostly happens. They put it as part of the substantive test. So they usually list it. So we find out that in other countries like Zambia and Botswana as well, they do the same. And the second one, you can add it as an exemption to the substantive test, like in the EU. So you say, okay, fine, all mergers will be based on competition standards, but then for some cases which bring about, if there's an argument that there will be a public interest criteria or concern, that's when it's added as part of the test. And then the others are sector-specific policies that run parallel to merger control, like in the US. In the US, they run parallel in terms of certain sectors that have to do with technological advancement or security. So it appears as national security. So those sectors that are in terms of energy and technology, they're assessed differently from the main all other mergers, I should put it that way. And then the other differences are in terms of the decision makers, like in South Africa and in the EU, the National Competition Authority is the main decision maker on the mergers. There are other countries that have politicians as the main decision makers. Namibia, France, and Germany. So they could have dual, as in where the competition authority comes in as well as the politician, but they have a sense of political interference in the major cases. There have also been arguments about that in South Africa, but it's not within the procedure framework of mergers. The others are sector regulators, like in Canada, where they have like the banking sector, which is regulated by, so all public interest criteria um, in terms of mergers in banks are evaluated differently from other cases. Okay, so the different forms of public interest in practice, we see that the United States, some of the different forms that it's had to incur national security and tax concerns. So it takes on cases of like so far what's happened. Excuse me. in times like this merger where there was the Canyon Brin and latest, so the case was concerned with national security, because these are all chip manufacturing companies. So uh, what a foreign firm wanted to buy a domestic firm in the US, which was concerned with chip manufacturing. And this merger was prohibited because it had to deal with national security. So this is considered as a public interest criteria because it's not within the confines of competition and competition law. The other one is Fresinger and Allegan. So for this merger, it was mainly to do with tax concerns because a United States firm wanted to merge with a firm from Ireland, and the thing was they were going to move their base to the other country where the taxes were favorable, and they had to intervene and block the merger and prohibit it based on these things. And the media was there was a lot of concern in the media that they have just started making things up just to prohibit mergers and all these things. But these are part of the concerns that the business world is having actually questions that, hey, we have a clear stated way of having to assess competition and mergers within these sectors, and then you are sort of adding other things that might not be part of this. In Europe, there's this famous case, Alstom and Siemens, which is still causing controversy now, as the French and German government have gone on to publish a lot of papers about why it was prohibited and how this stops them from making national champions. So the main argument for this merger in Europe was the making of a national champion that could compete with their counterparts in China. So these are all these are involved in the transport industry for trains, that is specifically making of the signaling for trains and all these things. So the merger was prohibited because it would lessen competition. But then the merging parties argued that no, we wanted to make a national champion, so it should be allowed to go through. But they couldn't prove that apart from that, the prices would go down from having this merger and all these things. So it didn't weigh in heavy enough for them to have the merger go through. And then another one is in Germany, sensitive technology and sale of a national champion. A foreign firm wanted to, a foreign firm wanted to acquire a domestic firm, and the domestic firm is seen as a national champion, and then and there was sensitive technology involved as well. So these are some of the things. SoftBank and ARM, it was allowed to go through because it was seen as the parties argued that the headquarters would be moving to Britain, and that was seen as something that would benefit the nation and the country at large. In developing countries, in Botswana, there's this major AON and AON. So the AON international firm wanted to acquire the domestic branch, the domestic firm in Botswana. And the main concern was what you call the spreading of ownership. They wanted most of the ownership to actually remain by remain to the Botswana citizens, rather than having another firm outside and coming to buy in the shares that are there. And then in Namibia as well, it appeared as part of employment in this merger here. So these are South African firms that were trying to acquire another firm in Namibia. So the other one was so the main thing about this was the inclusion of employment, and so they put a moratorium on employment, so that the restricted retrenchments over 2 years. Okay. So when it comes to South Africa, what are the public interest concerns? So from the enactment of the Competition Act in 98, the first, before it was amended in 98, all these criteria were included. So this is, so there were four main public interest criteria that were included, and these are said to be assessed as part of the substantive test, together with competition goals. So their effect on a particular industrial sector or region, impact on employment, the impact or ability of small businesses or firms controlled or owned by historically disadvantaged persons to become competitive. So the broad black-based economic empowerment is part of this. In this study, I split them into two, as the ability of small businesses to perform and broad black-based economic empowerment, just to see if there are differences in terms of assessing the different cases. And lastly, the ability of national industries to compete in international markets. So they also consider all these things when assessing mergers. Some of the cases that happened in South Africa so far are the Walmart Massmart merger that was proposed in 2010, finalized in 2011. So this merger was approved subject to commitments or subject to conditions on that the merging parties committed to developing a project supporting local suppliers, including a contribution of 100 million rand over 3 years. Okay, and then there were obligations to rehire previously retrenched employees that were where the retrenchments were done specifically for this merger. So there were those things that came into about on that on employment and the support of local industries. Recently in March, that's 2 months ago, or 2 months ago, PepsiCo and Pioneer merger actually was finalized, and it was approved as well, subject to commitments. So the focus on this merger was a great spread of ownership of owners of workers and historically disadvantaged individuals. So the PepsiCo agreed to increase the broad black-based economic ownership plan, and PepsiCo will be issuing 1.6 billion of its ordinary shares to broad black-based trusts belonging to Pioneer Food South African employees. And then there's a retrenchment moratorium of 5 years. 5 years. So for 5 years, there'll be no major related retrenchments. And then they'll also maintain wholesale and distribution agreements with historically disadvantaged individuals. And also there is also establishment of a development fund amounting to 600 million rand. So these, and lastly, they agreed that the head office in South Africa, the head office will remain in South Africa. This is in terms of tax residency and everything else, which is something also we saw in a previous case in a developed country where the agreements were in terms of headquarters and tax residency. Yeah, so this is how the cases have been. So different studies on public interest in South Africa have mainly focused on this on a case-by-case basis of the evaluation of public interest. So we do see. So the argument is that since most of these cases are actually evaluated on an ad hoc basis, but then everything is in black and white, it's written down. So we do see that, okay, fine, this is how this case was evaluated, this is how this case was evaluated. But we also need a broader picture of what's been happening, because a lot of other cases which are not as public as this ones or publicized as this, we don't really get to see what's happening. So I wanted to have a broader picture of what is happening with public interest within within the economy, and if there's a way of trying to find out or adding a bit of predictability, if I can say, to finding out how long, looking at them retrospectively, how long have these cases been taking, and what are the decisions that, what are the probability of the different decisions, if you have such concerns in the cases. Okay, so for the methodology, I'll do the data collection and sampling, and then the variable description. That are there. I'll try not to be too technical. So for the data collection, so the case is I used large mergers. That's the thing. So my data includes large mergers. So all the large mergers in South Africa were the ones that have taken place, or the ones I could find, that is. Okay, so it's an almost population of all large mergers. I'm sure I could have missed a few, but it's an almost calculation, almost population of it. So it's from 2006 to end of the financial year 2018-2019, that is. Okay, so I had to extract all the information from the tribunal decision files. So they published reasons for the decision. So I extracted the information to get the different variables that you'll be seeing in the next slide. And then I put them onto an Excel sheet and did the analysis on R. So that's just part of the data collection that I was doing. So I had to read through all the decision files and then see what they were talking about and try to extract the different variables that I could find. The sampling, I stratified by year type. And then, so what I did, the financial years, so I divided the data into stratified the data into different financial years. And within the different financial years, I stratified the data into those cases that had public interest concerns and those that didn't have public interest concerns. I included, since the ones with public interest concerns don't appear as much, I included all of them in the sample, and then I did a simple random sampling for the ones that didn't have public interest criteria, so that I could do weighting and it would be representative of the entire population of the different of the large mergers. Okay, so the variables that are there, there's a tribunal decision, which is what I spoke about earlier. So this is the decision to approve or conditionally approve. So it's a dummy variable. There is duration, which is a continuous variable. So this duration, there are different lengths of the duration. So the case is first filed at the commission, and then the commission finalizes the case. That's the competition commission. And then they send the case to the tribunal. The tribunal sets a hearing date, and then there's a hearing date and the date for issuing the order. And then there's a date when the reasons are published. So they're different durational variables. But for this presentation, I've just included the duration, which is from the date when it's filed at the commission to the date when the order is given. So the order is when the decision for the tribunal is given, basically when they tell you we have approved or approved with condition. So that's what I capture. The variable vertical just captures the vertical aspects of the merger. If there were if it was a vertical merger, that is. So I'm assuming they all have horizontal aspects, but then there are some mergers that actually have vertical aspects. So that captures that. Competition concern. So if there was a competition concern in that case, so this is not to necessarily say the commission or the tribunal concluded that there would be a lessening of competition, but the competition concern that is captured here is whether there was if there were cases of history of collusion, or if the commission said that there would be coordinate effects that would deal with concerns or unilateral effects and all these things. So if there was a competition concern resulting from the proposed merger, that's what captures that. Public interest concerns is having all those criteria. If one of the 4 criteria was actually found to be an issue in the case, that deals with public interest concern. So it's just an aggregate of all these other variables that are below here. So if any one of these variables was found to be in the cases, then I just included it under public interest concern, just to have a broad picture of it. Then there's a financial year. So as I concluded that the financial year starts from April. It starts from April and ends in March the following year. So I had to control for financial year, and I put it in just to check if, in case there were differences in the cases evaluation in the years. And then there's the sector control. Okay, so to start with the descriptives, just to find out, this is what has been, how prevalent public interest has been over the years. So starting from 2006, 2007 financial year, this is how public interest has been changing over years, okay? So we see from having 2 cases in 2006, 2007 to no case at all in 2007, 2008. The case that was there in 2007, 2008 is not a large, there was 1 case, but it wasn't part of large mergers. So in this data set, it's not showing there. So to having 34 to 18 cases in the financial year 2017, 2018, and the financial year 2018, 2019. So we see that these public interest criteria cases are actually, the arguments for having public interest criteria are actually increasing over time. And then for the different types, I just try to break it down to the different types. For the 2006, so the blue one is employment. And we see that employment has been more of a constant concern throughout the cases as we move from the 2006, 2007 financial year to the 2018, 2019 financial year, with its peak at the 2017, 2018 financial year. Another one has been the ability of small businesses, which has also been there. And then broad black-based economic empowerment as well has been an occurring one. So as I said again, the ability of small businesses and broad black-based economic empowerment are included under one factor in the Competition Act, but I wanted to see if there were actually differences in terms of evaluating that. Okay, so the econometric analysis, I use OLS, ordinary least squares. I assume a linear relationship. This is for duration, where I'm trying to check if the duration is different for the different cases. And then I use a Probit model for cases where I'm trying to check if there was a difference in the probability of approval or conditional approval over time. So this is just these are just the basic forms of both models. I didn't want to go into the math too much.
I have a question, if I can ask
Yes,
about your model specification. So duration obviously takes value between 0 up until something, right? So
yes,
you cannot take negative values. And,
no, it can't.
So is it? Do you need to take this into account? I mean, is it possible that your estimates are such that whatever predicted values would lie below 0? Maybe you should, I don't know whether you consider this, but maybe you should. So
okay, yeah, but it does take values from 0 to 0 to, so it's counted in days. since it was filing.
Right.
It was filed. So
maybe it's not an
yeah.
issue.
Yeah, but I'll look into that again. Yeah, but I didn't think it would be a problem. Okay. So I hope it's quite visible on your screen. No. Okay. So this is it. So for the OLS, where I logged duration, so that the coefficients could easily be interpreted. So for the I also used tribunal decision in this regression, so that it as a control, just to control for the differences in those that were conditionally approved and those that were just approved without conditions. So in the first two regressions, I included public interest concern in terms of the general public interest, not split into the different factors. So we get to see that for the first and second, with the different financial year controls and no financial year control here, it's still robust to 18%. So it tells us that public interest cases that have public interest concerns on average over the years have taken about 18% more time to evaluate, okay, than cases that didn't have public interest concerns. And this is after controlling for if they also had competition concerns, okay? When we break it down into the different categories of different dimensions of public interest, we find out that employment cases are not, they do not significantly take up more time in terms of evaluation compared to those cases that didn't have employment, as well as ability of local firms and ability of local firms. So we see that broad black-based economic empowerment actually takes up more time to evaluate, which is on average 40 across. If we average across the regressions, it's like 42% more time to evaluate. Which means if there's a concern about BBE in your cases, you take up to, you should expect that it should take up to 41% more time. So the reason why this is also important is because in the Competition Act, it states that at the end of a case should be, a merger should be, you should have a decision at the end of 60 working days, that is, okay? So that's the baseline for what that we're working for. So which means if you have a public interest concern, you are actually looking to take more time into that, and you can put that into account. Okay, and impact on a particular industrial sector as well takes a bit more time to evaluate as compared to other cases. All right, and now moving on to the other regression, the Probit regression, the Probit model. We find that there are differences. So this is a Probit model. So these coefficients aren't exactly interpretable, but I'll get to that. So as in the magnitudes aren't interpretable. I should say that. So you just interpret the signs and the direction of the coefficients. So we find that there are actually differences in cases that have these concerns that are brought up as arguments. So if you just bring up employment as argument or BBBEE as argument, on average, these cases will actually are more likely to be conditionally approved if they come up in cases. So there's employment, broad black-based economic empowerment, and ability of small firms. The other two, which is ability of local firms to compete and impact on a particular industrial sector, aren't significantly different across all the regressions. So they aren't taken into account. If you bring in these two arguments to say if you are coming for a merger, then you are more likely to get, or if this argument does come up, it's more likely to get approved without conditions. But if you bring up the other three concerns, history has shown that they actually do get approved with conditions. And that's for the different sectors that are, I mean, different controls that are put in down there. So if we try to quantify this and put a unit to this, I did marginal fixed effects for the different regressions, and then I found out that for employment, the probability, so these can be interpreted as probabilities for conditional approval. Okay, so for employment, you have, on average, if I try to average these, it's like a 40% probability, or 0.4 probability of actually getting conditionally approved. When you look at the BBE, as well across the regressions with different controls, that is, to just check if it's robust, it's also right around the same place, with although it actually jumps a bit as compared to this one. But you also see that there are differences, and it's the probability of being conditionally accepted is actually or conditionally approved is actually quite high. But the highest is actually the ability of small firms, showing that the tribunal or the competition commission actually take this mandate of having to control for the ability of small firms more than cases that don't have small firms. So they're more adamant in protecting small firms than they are in protecting the other interests as well. But it also seems that the BBE is also second to that, which is the probability of having a conditional approval when the case has broad black-based economic empowerment is actually quite high. So if your cases do come up with these two arguments, so if there are other parties that bring in these two arguments, it means that the probability of approving without conditions is quite low. You should be expecting that the cases will be approved with conditions as you go along. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Back to where we started, which are the objectives. So what we found out that is, first of all, over the years, number of public interest factors that have been considered and appeared in arguments for mergers has increased. And the duration is longer for cases with public interest criteria. We've also established that. And among the different criteria, cases involving broad black-based economic empowerment considerations take significantly more time compared to other cases. Also, cases involving impact on a particular industrial sector take up more time. And then when we come to the consistency, there are differences in the tribunal decisions for public interest factors, which could be viewed as a difference in the weighting of the factors. So we see that there are differences in the probability of approval, if I can put it that way. And then we also see that when we come into the different public interest factors, it could be a signal that the different factors are not weighed the same. They're weighed differently, because once you add one criteria in, the probability of having your case approved with conditions is higher than it should have been if it didn't have that. All right, thank you. There are any questions?
Thank you very much, Prince. If there are any questions, please just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, so I'm Mar Pretorius. I see my name doesn't appear. Prince, I was wondering why there's a difference in your sample size for the two regressions. So if you compare the OLS with the Probit one, you have a larger sample, I think, for the Probit one. Is there a difference in how you assembled your samples, or can you explain that for me?
The difference there just comes in because of the variable for duration. So since duration takes up the date when it was filed at the commission to the date when the order was given at the tribunal, for the OLS regression, most of those things, because there was some missing data, especially on the part of where I had to collect the data from the commission. So it omitted most of those cases where data was missing. So that's why there's a difference in the number of cases between the two regressions.
Okay, I also have a question. So in the first regression on duration, you use just a dummy for public interest, right?
Yes, please.
But you don't use a dummy for specific, these 4 categories. Why is that?
Oh, no. I do use their all dummy variables, the 4 categories. Right. So if you, okay, what is it? So this just means that cases with employment, cases without employment. So they're all dummy variables. They're not, it's not a categorical variable. Yeah.
So with that respect, I mean, is it possible to make some sort of quantification of the cost of handling these cases, in the sense, because it takes some resources and time. Maybe there is some records at the Competition Commission of the time that is spent on specific cases. So actually, maybe it's not needed, but at some time can be used to predict the effort needed to handle those cases.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I'm just not sure how to do that at the moment. But the reason why I was actually bringing in duration was because I thought it would be a good proxy for the costs that are being incurred in this cases. Because I mean, apart from the longer procedure that it might take for these cases to go through, the other problem would be the conditions that they set on these cases. And then if they're putting restrictions on retrenchments for 5 years, that's another cost that you didn't think of. If they're coming in with the development of a fund, that's another cost you didn't predict. So yeah, so I think there are different ways to really think about the cost. I'm not sure how to get the information for the other things or how to quantify the other things yet. But for now, I think the only way I can quantify the cost is in terms of the time that it takes, or time that is lost from wading through the procedure.
Right, and another comment, so the duration, as well as the decision to conditionally accept the merger, they are sort of interrelated. So maybe there's some way you can actually estimate them jointly, right? So I think there are some methods that would allow you to doing this.
Okay, that would be good to look into.
Are there any other comments or questions you want to ask?
Hi, Prince, Daniela here.
Hi,
I thought your research is very interesting, particularly for the competition authorities. But I was just wondering if you are going to consider making any recommendations or solutions around how they can improve the timeframes of the assessment. And as Lucas mentioned, the costing. I think that would be very helpful.
Okay. Thank you. I'll look into it. I think the main thing is really looking into the costing and seeing how that could actually be because I think that the main premise on which this is based is basically that business owners and all these investors are really concerned in terms of the unpredictability of the major cases going through, and case study. I should put it that way, because apart from having, apart from it being a developing country, but it has had these public interest criteria embedded in all the assessments ever since it was started. So it would actually be quite good to get some insight from that. So I think I'll look into the costing and see as well the different recommendations that would come from that. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Can I just, Chris, I was thinking, so where are you heading with this? So any idea to fine tune this? I was thinking about the difference between when there's international players involved or stuff like this. So are you thinking about fine tuning these two models that you have? Or are you thinking about expanding it to other questions, to other issues? What's your thinking on future research?
I'm thinking of, yes, fine tuning these two models as well. I think I want to find I want to see if actually protectionism can actually play a role in this. So if I can find a way of identifying if there are foreign firms in here and seeing if that can work, because I also see in the amended acts they actually are bringing about something, another team to evaluate foreign mergers, which is, I think you need to have good data on that to make such a, it's not clearly stated why that is being done, but I think you actually need to have good reasons for doing that and having, so maybe there's a form of protectionism. So it's good to assess and see whether that has been the case. And apart from that, I think going forward, I also have some data on the different conditions that were approved. So I'm also looking into if actions are structured, because they seem to be a bit ad hoc from case to case, but maybe they assess them, or the way they structure the different remedies for the different mergers to go through. Thank you.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi. It's Elanya here. A comment rather than a question. So I think this is really fascinating.
Thank you.
And of course looks more from the competition authority side than from the firm side. So what I'm thinking is it would be interesting to also consider how knowing this would impact on the strategy of the merging firms. So if you know that a firm with a BE component is going to take longer to get through, it might cause the merging parties to sort of rethink the structure in some way. So maybe that's just something to consider.
Okay, thank you.
Also, just one comment or question. So according to your estimates, the biggest impact on the decision has still the competition concern, right? But but then public interest concern is also very important, and actually, like, the difference is not so big based on your estimate, which seems that eventually in South Africa the public interest concern is like almost the same like the competition concern. I wonder whether it's something to comment on this, because it seems to me that given your estimates that many mergers are actually being accepted subject to remedies because of this issue, which is less important in other countries. And as you discussed in the introduction, there may be some efficiency issues related, of course. So if many mergers are decided on this basis, yeah, they may not, like the leading decisions in South Africa are not based on economic efficiency.
Yeah, I think so as well, because I think some of the arguments that I read through the papers were that some of the people that were opposing the inclusion of public interest concerns in merger evaluations stated that the more we pursue some of these auxiliary goals in competition law, will loosen up on competition, on strengthening competition. But if we just focus solely on competition, then we'll be able to achieve some of these public interest goals without having to use resources for other things as well, instead of just looking solely at competition. So I think it's also in line with what you're saying right there, that it seems as if the resources could actually be split on different bases of public interest and competition.
All right, are there any other questions? We are about to approach 3 p.m. So if there are no other questions, then we can finish with the presentation. So I would like to thank you again for interesting presentation, and good luck with your other papers. And we'll have a seminar next week, which will be also presented by a researcher from University of Stellenbosch, Vavan Kosi. It will be on cartels and cartel enforcement in South Africa. So everybody's warmly welcome to attend next week. Otherwise, thank you very much and hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prince.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prince.